Hi, all. Thank you for joining me. My name is Alison Reppert-Gerber, and I'm the Preservation Coordinator for the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives. Today, I'd like to talk to you about an exciting new initiative at the Smithsonian that seeks to leverage our existing resources as well as cultivate new partnerships to achieve our common goal of long-term preservation for our audiovisual collections. Now, when you think about audiovisual collections, it stirs up a multitude of questions that affect how we approach preservation. At the Smithsonian, most of the audiovisual collections are held by our archival units, and these units often have different resources available to them and employ the use of workflows unique to them and their collections. For many of these archives, collections are considered mixed media, meaning that several format types, which can include paper and photographs, are stored within one container. Collections may or may not be item level cataloged, and even if they are cataloged, the information about formats, duration, content may not exist or be accurate. Then there's the issue of generations of content. How many copies exist within the collection and which copy is the best? Do we have the playback equipment and digitization infrastructure to create preservation level files to preserve the content found in these collections? Do we even have the staffing capability to care for these collections properly? And are our collections in optimal storage conditions for their specific audiovisual formats? In 2008, Smithsonian staff began to think about these issues in a centralized way. In a grassroots effort, the Audiovisual Archives Interest Lunch Group was formed to discuss common issues facing DC-based archivists and collection managers caring for audiovisual collections. This group later formalized into the Smithsonian's Audiovisual Archives Institutional Leadership Group, which supports staff through professional development, funding opportunities, and general resource sharing. So it was not until 2014 that the Smithsonian looked to gather pan-institutional data on our audiovisual collections in hopes of creating centralized solutions to preservation. After our Office of Policy and Analysis released their report, our audiovisual archivists recognized that a more comprehensive survey and assessment were needed to inform our next steps. And then over the next 5 years, the Smithsonian Institution Archives spearheaded efforts with funding from the Smithsonian National Collections Program to conduct a pan-institutional audiovisual collections survey and then an audiovisual preservation readiness assessment to determine our greatest needs in terms of audiovisual preservation and provide recommendations for moving forward as one Smithsonian. In 2019, the Smithsonian Institution Archives, now the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives, proposed a new initiative, the Audiovisual Media Preservation Initiative, as a centralized resource to alleviate some of the burden from individual Smithsonian units to catalog, preserve, and provide access to our audiovisual collections. AVMPI is currently supported by 2 advisory teams comprised of Smithsonian staff from around the institution. The task force serves as our subject matter experts, determining where our efforts are best spent and developing standardized workflows and documentation based on best practices. This team meets most frequently, about several times a month, to complete specific tasks to move our goals forward. The advisory committee are our senior level leaders across the Smithsonian who have a bigger picture view of the organization and available resources that would support audiovisual preservation. This group meets just on a quarterly basis. The AVMPI strategic plan outlines 5 major goals over the next 5 years. First, our largest goal is the planning, design, and construction of a new state-of-the-art facility to support the treatment, cataloging, and digitization of select audiovisual formats. Complete with a conservation lab, digitization suites for audio, video, and film assets, and temporary collection storage, this space would serve as the primary location for AVMPI staff. Our second goal is to prioritize our collections in terms of both content value and format degradation risk to determine what gets preserved first. Next, we will be developing standardized workflows for imaging, cataloging, digitization, and the physical preparation and treatment of collections. This will allow us to not only ensure we are following best practices, but to also set centralized standards for each individual unit collection in order to streamline the preservation process. Our fourth goal is to ensure that we have the digital infrastructure to support the creation and long-term preservation of digital files. Due to the sheer size of audio and video files, it's important for us to maintain clear communication with our OCIO to convey upcoming projects and their needs. And then lastly, once collections have been preserved, we need to develop SI-supported solutions for access to audio and video files. While copyright issues may prevent open access to some of our collections, we want to meaningfully highlight as many collections as is possible. The proposed AVMPI team consists of 7 positions, with one of the first hires being the initiative coordinator. The coordinator will serve as the project manager, overseeing the operations, logistics, and financial aspects of AVMPI. To support the treatment and digitization of collections, 2 media conservation specialists will focus on the physical preparation and descriptive cataloging of each media asset that is preserved through the initiative. We'll have 2 preservation specialists, one for audio and one for video, that will be responsible for the digital transfer, quality control, and DAMS ingestion of each digital file. And then in order to support accessibility and educational goals, there will be 2 additional positions, a rights and reproduction specialist and a curator. Copyright issues can be a huge hindrance in providing access to audiovisual materials, and we want to dedicate a full-time position to researching and securing copyright if possible. The content specialist or curator will focus on developing new educational content for the collections that are preserved under the initiative. They'll work both independently and in tandem with unit staff to create engaging stories and highlight them on existing and new access platforms. We're currently in the final stages of selection for both the coordinator and curator positions and hope to bring them on board soon. As the leaders for AVMPI, they will have approximately 6 months of preparation time to become familiar with our collections and their needs before we're planning on bringing the specialists on late in 2022. So since 2020, AVMPI has already made significant progress towards many of our goals. As you can see here, we've been able to move forward with developing our human capital by hiring 2 staff members, like I said, and planning for the recruitment of 5 more positions. Working closely with our Office of Human Resources, we've developed rating plans and job analyses for all positions that would fully support AVMPI goals. As previously mentioned, creating standardized workflows is incredibly important to achieving our preservation goals. And one of the first accomplishments we've had on this front is to determine our business process requirements. This will ultimately support the development of a custom tool to track intake, conservation treatment, cataloging, digitization, and quality control processes. We've also developed a memorandum of agreement, which will outline what resources AVMPI will need from individual units to support the preservation of their collections. Digital imaging and physical workflows are also being developed or have been finalized at this point that would support a streamlined approach to preservation. And then lastly, we're working on a stakeholder questionnaire to determine the current capacity of individual units to participate in AVMPI. Advocacy for our audiovisual collections and their needs is critical to acquiring the resources to support preservation. Our SI advancement team has worked to create a story map, which highlights some of our most important collections and the goals of AVMPI. This resource is currently available to the public, along with our website located within the Smithsonian Institution Archives web pages. Over the next year, AVMPI will also deploy the stakeholder questionnaire that I previously mentioned and host an informational session to answer any questions from our partners from around the institution. We're in the midst of planning a sizzle reel, which will be used as an advocacy tool for AVMPI, as well as our social media strategy for engaging social media managers from SI units to promote digitized audio and video collections. And lastly, we've begun to plan for the development of the AVMPI facility and other workspaces. Taking a 2-phased approach, we will design and build out a phase 1 space that will accommodate our short-term preservation goals. And then the second phase of construction would build onto that space to achieve the full facility requirement of AVMPI. This would include a temporary collection storage space and a conservation lab. Our Office of Planning, Design, and Construction has already begun site evaluations, and we hope to make a space determination soon. And in the interim, the AVMPI task force is also looking to conduct a preservation pilot to test out our workflows. And this will require an existing space at SI to support that project. So thank you so much for your time today. I now look forward to answering any questions you may have. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. So we're just going to dive right in with questions. The first one that came in was, how will you decide what collections should be digitized in-house versus sending to vendors? So I think the approach that we're going to take, we're going to employ both of these methods. I think that we will focus on collections that we have a high quantity of, and that we currently have the capability and the specialized experience to handle on site. Some of our more specialized formats, such as wax cylinders or transcription discs, will probably be sent to vendors because we don't have very many of them, and it doesn't really make sense for us to build up our infrastructure to be able to handle them. There are also people in the field who specialize in specific formats, and it really makes more sense for us to employ their services to digitize them. Second question, what has been the hardest part of getting the initiative off the ground? So I think one of the biggest challenges was first getting the data that we needed to make our case for support. So it took us quite a few years to do the survey and the assessment to even be able to know what we had and what our needs might be. Thankfully, in that assessment part, we had clear recommendations, and so we could really use those to advocate to senior level leaders that that this was really important for us as an institution, and that these collections were at high risk, maybe higher risk than some of our other collections, and we needed a comprehensive plan soon to be able to digitize the majority of our collections within the next 15 years. And so I think the hardest part has been just convincing folks that this is a really big need for us, that will cost us a bit of money, but is certainly worth it in terms of collections care. Next question, is it common to be able to get copyright and or make materials open access? So for audiovisual materials, this can be really complicated, depending on who filmed things or recorded certain things. They can hold the copyright for those, and it can be really challenging for us to get that to be able to provide access. I think it will ultimately be easier for us to provide access to researchers, but as far as open access goes, basically providing free access and allowing folks to reproduce those materials without any sort of limitation is going to be really challenging for audiovisual collections. Obviously, the focus of this initiative is preservation, so we are really just focusing on digitizing the collections. That's our #1 priority. But as you can see with the team that we've built, access is also really important to us, and uncovering those hidden collections. AV collections are particularly challenging to determine what the content is at times, because you have to play them back if there's no identifying information on the carriers or on the housing. And so by digitizing them and preserving them, it will also give us access to content that we may never have known that we had before. So open access is a tricky question. We're hoping to be able to provide access, open access to some, but certainly not all our AV collections. Okay, does anybody else have any other questions? Looks like we have one coming in now. Okay, so next one is, what workflow for providing captions to these collections? So I think that's, what is the workflow for providing captions to these collections? So that's something that we're in the middle of developing the workflow for right now, is captioning requirements. There are several groups around the institution that are working on accessibility requirements when it comes to AV collections. And so oftentimes we rely on vendors for this. The process for captioning audiovisual collections can be quite tedious. Oftentimes we estimate that it takes about 3 hours of work for 1 hour of content. And so there are vendors out there who specialize in this. And so once we have the standard workflow in place for exactly what we're looking at and what requirements we're going to be following, we will be able to work with vendors on that. The cost for transcription and captioning is also quite high. So that's another thing that we are going to have to focus on as we move forward to be able to provide access. Next one is the funding for this initiative ongoing? Yes, it is. So we have lots of groups around the institution and externally who are interested in this. And there have been a lot of partnerships around the US and internationally with private corporations, different nonprofit organizations. And so we are looking everywhere for funding. And sometimes it is more successful for us to target specific groups for specific things. So I believe in my presentation, I did mention that the National Collections Program, which is an internal group to the Smithsonian, is funding our staff for 3 years. But we also have approached other groups to talk about transcriptioning and captioning, and if they would be interested in that. We are planning our sizzle reel, our little teaser trailer for AVMPI, and we're talking to different groups around the institution for that. So in an ideal world, yes, I guess it would be great if one person decided to give us all the money to support the initiative for the foreseeable future. But unfortunately, that's not quite how it's working out. And so, yes, we're actively seeking funding and actively seeking partnerships, both internally and externally, to keep this going. Next question. In terms of advocacy, what would you recommend someone who works in an organization where the AV collection is small compared to the rest of the collection? Why is this important? What would I recommend? So I think that something that I said earlier that was really important for us was the survey and the assessment that we did. Just knowing what you have and what the condition of those collections are can be a huge advocacy push. So if you're able to communicate to whoever you need to, and oftentimes it's everybody, I feel like it's everybody who needs to be advocated to, you have the data in hand to support what you're saying. So if you can identify how many of what format you have, what the basic condition issues of those are, potentially what your risk of loss is for those. So if you can verbalize in the next 5 to 10 years what sort of collection loss you're looking at, those can be some of the most important advocacy tools for that. It can feel a little dire at times, particularly with AV collections. A lot of them are actively deteriorating, and it's a challenge to be able to digitize those in time. But sometimes that is also the strongest advocacy story. Nobody wants to lose collections and their content, and particularly if they are unique. So for a smaller organization, I would focus on those collections as you can that are actively deteriorating, in case you don't want to lose those. So that's what I would recommend for that. Oh, this next question is gonna test my knowledge. Okay, so what is the oldest AV material the SI holds? So I'm not well versed with everybody's collections. I do hold a lot of data on them, but I would probably say that some of our oldest is our wax cylinders. The archives holds a collection of wax cylinders that have recordings on them of Native American celebrations and rituals. And now, of course, I'm trying to remember what the date on those are. I think that it's around 1920s, but don't hold me to that. But it's our wax cylinders, I would say, are our oldest collections right now, and some of the most challenging to get the content off of. Next question. How do you envision converting file types in the future in order to keep current? Yes, that is a huge challenge. So as we're planning workflows and starting to digitize collections, obviously we're trying to make the best decisions that we can at the time for the best file formats that are available. But if you look 10 or 15 years ago, what file formats were preservation standards, some of that has probably changed over the last 10 or 15 years. And so migrating those files to new file types can be really challenging. And that's where our partnership with OCIO, our internal IT group, comes in. Thankfully, we have a robust DAM system, our digital asset management system, that all of these files are going to be going into. And migration potentially in the future is part of that discussion. And so, yes, guidance forthcoming on that. That's a very popular phrase, but yes, something we definitely know is important to keep in our minds. Next question. Will there be some kind of integration between this and existing AV collections within SI already? Yes, so AVMPI was built basically as a support system for existing units. So the coordinator and the curator who we're bringing on board aren't actively collecting collections. This is really focused on what we already have on hand and making a large dent in preservation of those collections. And so the curator, part of their job is not only to help prioritize collections for digitization, but also to create new educational materials and exhibitions around these collections. And so that's all working with existing collections and existing curators and unit staff to be able to highlight those. So this is a very tight partnership between units and AVMPI. We're certainly not a standalone initiative. And so units and their collections are at the core of what we're going to be doing. How many items are in the collection and what percentage are you looking to digitize? So first part is easier to answer. So how many items are in the collection? We have about 300,000 AV assets right now that have been identified, but we are also very aware that there are probably more around the institution that we didn't gather in the survey and the assessment. And then what percentage are you looking to digitize? So it's a little bit more complicated. Part of properly prioritizing AV collections is trying to look at generational content. So around the institution, we probably have a handful of collections. I mean, we do have a handful of collections that probably were originally filmed or recorded on one type of media, and then over the years were transferred to different other carriers. So for example, you might have a 16mm film that was transferred to a U-matic at some point. And so we need to determine which copy of that is best, because if we don't have to, we don't want to expend resources to digitize both of them if one is clearly in better shape than the other. That can be really challenging if you don't digitize both of them, because you can only tell so much by the physical carriers. And you might think that one looks better than the other, but until you get it on the deck and actually digitize it, you won't have a great indication of which file is better. So we need to preserve all of the collections and all of the content, essentially. But diving into that and determining which assets we digitize based on how they've degraded over time is really challenging. So it's like a multifaceted answer to that. we have another question that came in. Have you decided on what target file specifications will you be using for AV digitization? Yes, I think that we're pretty close to having that standardized at this point. So we follow FADGI guidelines when we can. It's a federal agency digitization guidelines initiative. And so they already exist for certain format types, certain media types. And so it's really just with video and film that we have to decide which preservation standard file format we're going with. And so I think that we are mostly at a consensus. But once we decide that as an initiative, it's also important for us to work with the units to communicate that with them and make sure that whatever standard file format we're creating is acceptable to them as well. But we want to standardize things where we can to maximize the use of our resources. Next question, can transcripts of recordings be made available open access even if the underlying audio video cannot? That is a great question, and one that I have never gotten before. I will have to bring it back to my team. That I'm sure that that could be something that we consider. It's still making the content available in one form, and so I'm not sure where that lies with copyright. But it's really interesting. That's something that we would have to consider. And again, this is specifically an open access question. Access to our researchers and open access are two different things. And so even once we have these collections preserved and digitized, for a lot of them, if they're being used for educational reasons, we can provide access to researchers. It's just this question of open access and allowing folks to be able to take these files and manipulate them however they will without any sort of protections on those is different. And so I'm not sure with the transcripts if we'll be able to put those in open access or not. That's certainly a good question. Thank you. Okay, last question we're going to take. What percentage of materials will be completed with this phase? How much more funding is needed to accomplish this? So when we did the assessment, I think we determined roughly that we would need $40 million over 15 years and 28 full-time staff members to be able to digitize everything that has not been preserved in our collections. So those are quite high numbers, and we are nowhere near to having $40 million right now. But we don't have goals set right now for this first phase. We are still focused on trying to find space to be able to digitize these collections. And so once we have the lay of the land and can determine where we're putting people and where access to equipment is, we'll be able to set goals for this first phase. And it's really going to be a pilot phase to test out our workflows and see where modifications might be needed. So we don't have specific goals for that yet, but they will be forthcoming. And the second half of that question, how much more funding is needed to accomplish this? I don't have specific numbers, but quite a bit, depending on what path we take. But getting staff on board is the first step, and we are moving ahead with that. And so I'm very excited about that. Okay, I think that that's the end of my time. Thank you all so much for listening to my presentation and allowing me to answer some of your questions. Thank you, and have a great rest of the conference.